So, welcome everybody to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and today we are continuing our journey through the Daodejing, and we are currently in chapter 33. So, we'll go ahead and get started here. I want to start with a little bit of background before we jump into the text of this chapter, because I think this one was a little bit more challenging in terms of how do we pull all that information together. And I think this will help with that, making a little bit more sense of this chapter. One of the key things that's happening, well, I shouldn't say that's happening, that we have to be aware of when we're looking at a text that involves a strong sense of self-cultivation, of developing a certain way of being in the world, that there's a way of knowing that they're going to be engaging with that has to do with a type of knowing that can only be really understood through experience. And that makes it very difficult for how do we talk about it, because as much as we might understand something from our own personal experience, trying to share that with somebody who hasn't had the same experience is complicated. You could think of like riding a bike. We could talk about all the different sensations and features that we experience while we're riding the bike, the wind on our face, the challenge of, going fast and not falling over, kind of the thrill of, the danger, you could say, and all the different challenges of balancing and how you learn how to ride a bike. But until you actually get on a bike and try it for yourself, you don't really understand in the same way. And there's a lot of things in life we could point to like that. I know it was an unbelievable transformation for me in terms of having kids, that no matter how many books I read or the fact that I was a kid for my parents or any of these other things couldn't prepare me for the type of change and demands it has on you as a person that you really can only experience once you're in that situation. So we're always struggling then when we try to use words to describe something that is at its core experiential. And it's interesting thinking about knowledge in general, how much of it may actually be at its core, everything is only known through things that we've actually experienced. And we can take those experiences and extrapolate and tie other things together. But the more we get removed from having any type of actual experience or similar experiences that we can kind of connect with it, I think it becomes very difficult for us to actually understand or know things apart from that. So there's a very core aspect of this Taoist thinking that comes into this experience that they are trying to communicate in words. And at its core, there's this fundamental context that everything is connected, that everything is related to each other. And there's different ways that they try to express this and talk about it. In this chapter, they're going to go through a series of kind of contrast to help and bring about this understanding. But I want to try and review some of the core aspects of this. And it's going to be using a little bit more modern terminology because that's where we're coming from. And so I'm trying to bridge that gap between how they would talk about it and how we might talk about it. And there could be some differences that go beyond, what would have been in the original author's mind. But I think it is definitely in the same trajectory or in the same spirit of the intent. So when we're thinking about a relational world, one of the key components of this is that everything takes on its attributes or even its existence only in relationship to other things. So we've brought up before that tall or short don't mean anything apart from being compared to something else that's a different height. And height itself is an attribute that doesn't make any sense except for within a context. And everything that we could think about, whether it's speed or color or sound or sensation, everything is relational and only exists in relationship to something else. So this is a very mind-boggling kind of a concept that nothing exists by itself, but only exists in relationship to other things. Very interesting way to try and understand the nature of everything in our world. It also goes against the way that we normally think about things. The way we see and experience the world is that it's a series of things, of separate things that we can touch and manipulate and move, and it feels as though the world is made up of a bunch of separate things. So to say that everything only exists in relationship to each other and that they're all interdependent and ultimately all actually just one thing is really counterintuitive to our experience. And so getting to the point where we can actually experience the world as a oneness or in this relational sense takes a lot of effort. And we'll talk about how this is achieved here in a minute. But I'll just kind of give you another example of how we have a very solid experience of the world that is very contrary to what we know to be the truth about the world. So we can think about our understanding that the earth is orbiting around the sun, and yet we experience the seasons not so much in thinking about it in terms of the earth moving around. It feels like the earth is standing still. It also rotates, which gives the impression that the sun is rising and setting, but it's exactly the opposite. The earth is the one that is moving in that context, and the sun is more, it's not actually stationary, but it's in relationship to the rotation of the earth, it's stationary, and it gives the impression that the sun is rising and setting. And as much as we can know and understand that from a technical or scientific point of view, you go out in the morning and you cannot shake the experience of the sun rising or going out and watching the sunset, that is how it is perceived, how it feels. It takes a great deal of effort and convincing to know that it's actually other than that. And so much of our world is like that. We have very strong sense of things as the way that they are, that is very different from the reality of it. And so we have this battle that we have to do against what's actually kind of called naive realism, that how we perceive the world is the way that the world actually is. And it's a strong argument, right? Somebody, if we didn't have access to all the tools that we did, could argue very convincingly about, the sun rising and setting. They just say, come on outside, look, you can see it for yourself, right? It's not an easy thing to shake, and it takes effort to get to that different way of looking at it. The other thing that we talk frequently about, and especially when we talk about Tao, is how there are ways that things operate, that there's patterns. And key for our minds is to understand those patterns, because it becomes part of how we survive in our world. We have to understand how things work, what things are dangerous, what things are good for us. And the fact that there are these patterns that happen are essential for us to be able to learn anything about the world, but they also help us to and literally for everything in the world to actually exist as well. So if we think about something like, breaking it down to the level of atoms, if they didn't behave in the ways that they do with electrons and how they connect to other atoms to form molecules, and it wasn't consistent in how they did that, everything in the universe, including ourselves, would just simply fall apart. So these predictable, regular patterns are the basis for life to even be possible. And it's also the basis for us to be able to learn anything about the world that we exist in. But that also means that we're part of that we are not separate from the world. We are actually in the world. And so we are also made up out of our relation to the things around us. We take on those attributes and those ways of being in that type of relationship, and we're subject to those same kind of patterns, which means our ways of being in the world are really dictated by this context that we find ourselves in. And so we have this idea that we're these free acting agents, but in reality, our sense of agency emerges out of the context that we find ourselves in, how we engage with our world. And it's another one of those things that is a very strong illusion that is very difficult to break. And it's not necessary that we fully break that illusion, because it is how we engage in our world, but it is necessary to understand that it is an illusion so that we don't confuse this idea of agency with the ultimate nature of how things are operating in the world. And so then all of this we find very contra to how we would just kind of normally think that the world is based off of our innate experience of it. Our naive realism would just be, yep, what I see is what's actually there. How I'm engaging with the world is what it really is. And the sun really does rise because I see it rising, and it really does set because I see it setting. So to get to this point then of understanding that our world is a bit different from how we experience it, to get to the point of being able to experience it in the way that it actually is, requires a lot of effort. Now, in addition to just our normal sense perceptions, we have cultural perceptions that become ways of coloring or shaping our world and the way we experience it based off of worldviews that we hold and the ways that we are trained to see the world. And that becomes another layer that we have to work at from the Taoist perspective of removing. Not necessarily that we don't ever have any perspectives, because they're advocating for a perspective, but they're helping us to understand the subjective nature of those perspectives so that we don't confuse them for the objective reality, but a way of looking at the world that is maybe useful, but not necessarily accurate. Then when we're talking about a lot of these concepts, there is an intellectual way of understanding it, where maybe you hear the words that I'm saying and you understand the concepts, but that's going to be a little bit different than actually experiencing the world that way. So if we can get to the point where we're actually experiencing the world from that perspective, then it becomes more of an embodied knowledge. So when we talked about riding the bike, I can give you the instructions about it. I can tell you what to expect. I can tell you about the physics that's involved in riding a bike, but that'll take on a whole different level of meaning when you actually start riding a bike. You'll have an embodied knowledge of it. You'll have more of a experience of it that it kind of transcends our ability to talk about it. And so the contrast then to this intellectual knowing is this idea of embodied understanding. And in many traditions of either philosophy or religion, they have a way of talking about this embodied way of knowing something, or getting to that point where you are now experiencing this way of being in the world versus knowing about this way of being in the world. And it's referred to as enlightenment. So it's just a way of talking about how do we get to this embodied way of understanding and experiencing from this perspective that we're trying to achieve within this Taoist, and I want to really specify classical Taoist way of looking at the world. And how we ultimately get there is through this process of self-cultivation. And this will be doing things like really taking time to reflect and study on the nature of reality and what can we know about it. This can happen both from a book perspective, but it can also happen from just becoming much more mindful in our daily activities and our experiences about what's happening and trying to understand it from the perspective of what we know about the nature of reality. there's also the idea of going into more of a sustained reflection in terms of a meditation that can happen. And it takes a fair amount of effort to get to a point where you're actually experiencing the world from a different perspective, because we grow up and we are strongly enculturated in whatever culture we are that gives us all kinds of tools for how to look at the world that we don't even realize this is happening when we're kids. It's all happening before we have any ability to critique it or challenge it or ask questions. It's just kind of ingrained and assumed and adopted. We inherit it. And so breaking free of that and moving into a new way of looking at things definitely takes some effort. It's not going to just happen because, we come to some lectures or maybe we casually read something. It takes a lot of intentionality of how do we adopt this mindset and start to perceive the world through that. All that to say that this is one of the big challenges with our text, especially today, but always when we're looking through here, is the limitations that words have for describing things that are embodied. So with that, let's jump into the text. Starts off by saying, knowing others is intelligent. Knowing yourself is enlightened. So here we have the first of the contrasts that are going to happen. And I think we want to keep in mind as we're going through the Daodejing always that there's a personal perspective in terms of how do we personally engage in the world, but there's also this political overtone that's always kind of side by side, because if this is ultimately something that was emerging out of the Warring States period and specifically for instructing someone who is in a position of leadership or rulership, then we need to always be thinking about how do these concepts apply at that level as well as the personal level. So if we're thinking about, well, before I jump into some of my thoughts on it, with this first contrast, knowing others is intelligent, knowing yourself is enlightened. What are your thoughts on what might be trying to get at here?
I think it's saying that like understanding others is a form of wisdom, but like really knowing yourself, that's where true enlightenment comes from. I feel like knowing yourself is actually a lot harder than knowing others, because you're able to perceive them from outside of their heads, obviously. And it's really hard, at least in my opinion, to perceive yourself.
Anybody else have some thoughts on that?
Knowing about others can never make you happy. That can only come from knowing about yourself.
Sorry, Dane, I couldn't hear you. Could you say that again, please?
I said knowing about others can never make you happy. Only knowing about yourself can make you happy.
And there's some interesting things I want to kind of pick up on both those comments. So with Taylor's, it's interesting the observation that it seems like it's easier to understand other people than it is to understand yourself. If we think about that for a moment, we know how complex we are and how difficult it is to know ourselves. Why would we think it's easier to understand other people if they're just like we are? And this is an honest question, because I think there's well, maybe I'll just kind of elaborate on this a bit. One of the challenges that we have with other people is obviously we don't see inside their head. We do have these things like mirror neurons that help us to have a sense of what somebody else is experiencing or intending based off of how we do things, that we can kind of connect with them in that regard. But because we only see the outside, it can appear that other people are much simpler than we are because we only see the outside of what's happening. We don't get a glimpse at the inside of who they are. And this is a very common dilemma that we find ourselves in because of the fact that we always experience everything from our personal perspective. You know, we are, in one sense, kind of the center of the universe because everything we see radiates out from where we are, and it creates a different impression of who other people are and other things are based off of, you know, where we're seeing things from. So it is interesting that it kind of feels like it's easier to know other people than it is to know ourselves. But if we think about it a little bit, it couldn't be, because if they are just as complex as we are, then how in the world could we ever begin to really understand anybody else? But I totally get what you're saying, Taylor, because it feels that way, right?
Yeah, I think with like cognitive dissonance, so like our actions and our beliefs kind of conflict with our self-image, and people tend to either like over credit themselves or be overcritical of themselves in certain ways, and we're all kind of in our own heads, whereas like you don't have other people's anxieties about themselves. You just are getting what you get, you know? So
Yeah.
Actually, there's two different things I've heard of that kind of fall in has been, one being the fundamental attribution error, where basically we attribute other people's decisions to their nature, and we attribute our own decisions to the circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
So we might say, oh, I dropped the coffee because the floor was slippery, whereas we might say, oh, that other person dropped the coffee because they're clumsy.
Mm-hmm.
And also I came across one of my favorite articles from that describes some psychology research where basically we're more creative and flexible in thinking of solutions for other people's problems than we are thinking for solutions to our own problems. So other people's problems seem like simple and easy to solve, whereas our problems seem nuanced and complex and intractable.
I
Yeah.
love that. I always use the example of like if you're at a restaurant and they asked for a side of ranch or something, but they didn't get it and they don't want to ask for it. It's so much easier to ask for it for them than be in their shoes and be like, oh, I didn't get my ranch, you know? It's just, I don't know what it is, but it's easier when it's your friend.
For sure.
Yeah, I found it's easier to, well, when it says knowing others is intelligent, it's because you're able to be objective. You're able to be that outside party versus knowing yourself. You have to be objective to yourself, which a lot of people struggle with because you have your own ingrained biases because you think to yourself, you talk to yourself all the time, whatever way your brain works, where everybody is in their own head to some degree. So it's hard to be objective to yourself. And that's where I think the enlightenment comes from. Like if you start to sit and think, oh, why do I act this way? That starts making you objective to yourself versus for knowing others. It's a lot more easier because, to your point, Jim, you're not in their head. And in theory, that should be more difficult because you don't know all of their nuances and things. But because you are able to be objective and outside of their head, you can see their problems or whatever easier. So doing that for yourself is a challenge because then you have to remove those biases and you have to force yourself to think outside of yourself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, for sure.
I think one of the other issues that I have found is that it's sometimes we believe that other people are like us, and we don't really appreciate what is the culmination of all of their experiences that make them into someone that is not the same as we are, and that can be very challenging to get an appreciation that, oh, there are things I don't know about you that explain how you are really different. And I think it does require a lot of intelligence to be able to get to the depth of understanding how people are different and what makes them do the things they do. I don't think we take as much time as I think we've already said to perhaps analyze ourselves. And so it's, again, I think we're kind of stuck in that, in those assumptions that can be misleading.
For sure. And along those same lines, so we've got this continuum where other people are like us and they are not like us. But then we also have the layer where we can kind of categorize groups of people, right? And this can come into play with stereotypes and other types of biases that also make it difficult for us to actually know something about the other person. So these are all been thoughts from like a personal perspective. It seems as though it's easier to understand and get at who other people are. But if they are in fact like us, then we have to acknowledge that our knowledge of other people is always going to be minimal, right? Because we can't actually know as much about them as we could about ourselves. And especially when we try to understand ourselves, how difficult that process is. It's kind of ironic that we think it's easier to understand other people. But if we look at this from then the political perspective, so much of what exists in terms of, let's say, government policy is about knowing what's best for other people. And that becomes really interesting, right? So the emphasis is really a lot on how do we maybe think we know or try to know other people for how we do things, and not really considering this difference, right, of what it takes to know yourself can give us a false sense of confidence of knowing what's needed for other people, because it seems so much easier to understand, or so we think, what they need or what's good for them. So this would be one of the first of the contrasts that's being made, is that there's a way of being in the world that thinks we can understand other people, that we can be intelligent about that, especially if we're thinking from a rulership position, but even just from a personal interaction with other people perspective, we can tend to collapse the complexity of that person into a much more simple object than we do for ourselves. And if we take the time to really understand ourselves, that lends to our recognition that there's no way these other people could be as simple as I typically think that they are. It's going to take it to the next part here where it says conquering others takes force. Conquering yourself is true strength. Now, this is one of the things Taylor brought up earlier about how much harder it is to know yourself, which is leading to this idea of enlightenment. But here, what we're seeing is a really interesting comparison that when we're trying to deal with other people, if we're trying to control, and we've had a couple of chapters now prior to this where we're talking about the use of violence, the use of force. We've frequently talked about the idea of culture itself, trying to get people to conform to their, expected position. And the way they talk about this is, this idea of carving or cutting to get things to fit, which is kind of a violation of its naturalness, the natural simplicity, let's say, of the uncarved wood. And so this would be one of those ways that we see that force or that cutting come into play, is when we're trying to actually control or manipulate or conquer other people. And again, we can think about this from either a political or a personal perspective. So another interesting aspect of this relational world is when I think about my identity, if who I am is who I am in relationship, then other people's perspectives of me forms a lot of how I see myself. And if there's a different image of myself that I'm trying to give birth to, let's say, I run into a problem if other people don't see me that way. So how do I deal with that? And there's a couple of different strategies, but one of the strategies could be to try and control other people's perspectives or the way that they're looking at things so that I can be the one that I want to be. But when there's this actual dyadic relationship where who we are is who we are in relationship to the rest of the community around us, then we have, if we're respecting that, then there's a whole different kind of level of strength in terms of that enlightenment that has to happen for how that is navigated, how we recognize this interconnected relationship between each other that can either be, I don't want to deal with that, and I'm just going to resort to using force to try and control, or I'm going to work towards trying to play off of those relationships, and how do those actually work in terms of that self-evaluation. Why are they seeing me this way? Is there truth to that? What is going on in the relationship that's bringing about those types of reactions, and how might I improve myself in order to actually be more of the one that I think I see of myself inside, that's actually going to be reflected on the outside in terms of how other people see me. Which gets into that much more difficult aspect that Taylor brought up in terms of not only knowing ourselves, but then also how do we bring about the kinds of changes in behavior that will really model what we're talking about. That requires a lot more fortitude and strength, it's saying here, in contrast to this idea of force. And of course, at the political level, you can see how this would also come into play. It's much easier to have laws and police and other things to try and coerce behavior and the way that things should be, as opposed to finding ways to entice people to want to do certain types of behavior because they can see that this is actually a better route for them to go. I'll kind of see if you guys have some thoughts on this.
For some reason, and I know this isn't like directly related to what we're talking about, but comparison came up in my head. Like when we think about ourselves in relation to other people, that's like my first thought is comparison. And sometimes it's when you have so many people around you and you're thinking about who they are and who you are, it's hard to not get into the tornado that is comparison and trying to make yourself something that relates to those people but also is not you.
Kind of the whole keeping up with the Joneses thing.
I don't know, I haven't seen it.
It's just a phrase.
Oh, okay. Is that a show or a movie or something?
They did make a movie out of that, but it was stuff of the saying.
Being up with the Joneses means that when your neighbors get a bigger car and bigger house and whatnot, you have to also get a bigger car and bigger house. So
I see. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But being a Jones, I would tell you, it's not real hard to keep up with me. So you can relax.
You just got to surround yourself with the right Joneses.
Yes, that's right.
And remember not to drink the Kool-Aid.
Oh, yeah.
That's
yeah,
right. Oh,
sure.
that's right.
Sure, Jim's heard that too many
Not
times
that
in
kind
his
of
life.
Jones.
Yeah, for sure.
To Taylor's point, though, is when we're talking about this here, I was kind of thinking about like a lot of people. I don't want to say everyone because I've seen the opposite true as well. Where if you go back to like your high school days, everyone was trying to fit in. That was the kind of the goal as a high schooler, is like you try to be in, you want to be cool, you want to wear the right clothes, all that stuff, keeping up with the Joneses-esque type thing. And then once you get out of school, most people realize that's useless. Like, what's the point in doing that? Because then you realize 99% of those people you went to school with, you are never going to see again. So what was the point of that? And that's where that coming into adulthood, the college experience is always brought up as like, oh, you're learning about yourself. That's kind of what keeps coming up to me, is like a lot of people go through that. And then it's after those years of public school and stuff that you truly start conquering yourself, because then you start to look inward and realize, oh, that I need to be more about me, not about what everybody else is doing. And I think a lot of people do this without ever thinking about it or truly noticing that that's what's happening. And you can tell when people don't do that, because there's always those couple people that still live in your hometown wearing their high school football jerseys, those cliches, you know, that you see the football quarterback from high school that's sitting at the bar drinking. Like, there are people like that in everybody's hometown that just never saw past that and never learned to look inwards and try to figure themselves out, because they went so far into trying to be a part of the crowd that they lost. They never tried to find themselves. So I think the conquering yourself is actually a pretty natural process for a lot of people as they grow, but they don't realize that's what's happening. And I think whenever you do realize it, that's just that extra level of enlightenment of, you realize what you are doing.
Mhm. Yeah, and it's definitely in our formative years, middle school, high school, this takes on kind of center stage. And we can see even in that context, you know, different techniques that people would use in terms of conquering, whether it's the bullies or, you know, the certain cliques that have all the power that everybody has to kind of cow to. Those are some different ways we can see that controlling of others in order to be the thing that they want to be, versus, you know, how do we find people that are more connectors and people who work with other people and develop, you know, real friendships. Yeah, and it's an ongoing spectrum that continues throughout our life. It's maybe not as obvious as it is when we're in high school, and hopefully we mature and learn from those years about how not to be. Doesn't always work, but you know, it's an ongoing process for sure. So then, if we think about, well, we'll get to this in just a second, but the next one here says, knowing what is enough is wealth. Forging ahead shows inner resolve. And this one, there's a couple of different ways that this one is translated, and there's a challenge with this particular pair, because it seems like they're in the reverse order. So let me just kind of look at this a little bit here. A couple of different ways that these two are translated. So wealthy are those who know what is enough, while those who force their way are merely ambitious. So here we can see a little bit more clearly how that contrast is happening. In the initial translation that we're looking at, forging ahead shows inner resolve. It doesn't necessarily sound like it's a contrary or a less optimal way of being. But when we start to see how some of the other translations look at this text, we can get more of the nuances that are happening from this idea of forging ahead. There's one other translation I don't have in here that says that, you know, those who try to achieve what they want through violence will get what they want sometimes, right? So it's kind of this forging or this force that's being used to get to something that they want, which is really bringing out this idea of ambition. which, given what we've seen in the Daodejing up to this point, is really kind of contrary to the whole idea of wu wei and spontaneity, and even with this first line, which is, knowing what is enough. And so because of that, more than one of the scholars I've looked at think that over the course of time, these two actually got accidentally swapped in terms of their order, that really the forging ahead statement comes before knowing what is enough. And so an example of one of the translators that went that direction says, those who move forcefully have ambition. Those who know what is enough have an abundance. And of course, they make kind of the nice comparison there between ambition and abundance. But you get the idea. It stays consistent with the way we've seen the different contrasts, and it helps to show a little bit more of what's being implied by this idea of forging ahead, that there's this more forceful way of trying to get to something that we could maybe see as a positive trait, because of course in our 21st Western American perspective, we definitely see that as a positive trait, that we want to be ambitious. We want to try and be steadfast and resolve and move forward in trying to accomplish our goals. So we might not notice initially how that contrast happens until we see some of the other ways that this is being translated. And maybe I'll pause here for a second to see if there's any thoughts on this pair.
I've frequently struggled with watching people who have amassed fortunes to understand when they would say that's enough. And I came to the conclusion several years ago that there is a sense of power that people feel that they can achieve if they have amassed a huge amount of wealth. Recently, in the golf world, John, I've forgotten his name, the golfer, joined the Live Tour and received something like $550 million. And I kept asking myself, what is enough? How many toys do you need? How many houses do you need? So I think it's a real conundrum to understand when it is enough. And I think it goes beyond ambition.
Yeah, and we see kind of a commonality now between like these first three pairs, that when we are focused on others, when we're focused on controlling others, when we're focused on forcing a way forward, there's a way of life that is not as reflective on the self and having that deeper understanding of who I am and who I am in relationship to others, and then also how to have that sense of contentment. So getting back to Dane's statement at the beginning about this idea of happiness, we could maybe look at this idea of contentment a bit along those lines, that if we're chasing after trying to know and control and forging ahead, we're not going to have that level of contentment. We're going to continuously be chasing after the next thing, having that more power, having that more control, having that more security, versus the idea of knowing the self, spending that effort on how do I develop my understanding, is going to lead more to this idea of contentment, of recognizing this is actually really amazing and I've got a lot going on here. And the more I can be content with that, I'm going to have wealth regardless of my station in life. So just to kind of show how so far these are kind of then being contrast, we had that idea of intelligence versus enlightenment, the idea of some type of knowledge versus this embodied lived understanding. We had the contrast between force and strength, and now we've had that contrast between ambition and the idea of contentment. There's one more pair that's coming up, and sometimes they're taken as an additional contrast, but others take it as more of the therefore that we normally see at the conclusion of one of these poems or chapters. And the more I've looked at this, the more I think that that's probably what's happening in this case, is that there's a little bit more of a implied therefore for how the last two statements come together, and they're not meant to be seen as a contrast. And I'll just lay them out here, and then we'll look at the passage. So one of them is this idea about, if we're understanding the idea of enlightenment and strength and contentment as the direction that we want to go, the therefore ends up into what is that kind of path that we want to go down to make sure that we're attaining those goals, as opposed to the intelligence, force, and ambition side of things. But also, to complicate things a bit, we don't want to forget that there's definitely this concept of yin yang, and that there's a spectrum and there's a time and a place kind of for everything, and it's this idea of balance. So it's not saying that it's wrong to have knowledge of other people. It's not wrong that we at times try to influence other people. It's not wrong that we have goals that maybe we're trying to achieve. It's when they're out of balance that these things become problematic. And again, the Taoist critique of the current social situation at their time was that this idea of being other focused and how do we control other people, and the problem of ambition, was really out of whack, and that was giving rise to the social chaos. Whereas if we put more emphasis then on how do we become, more self-aware and develop that inner strength and develop that contentment, we would be able to alleviate a number of those things that were causing the chaos of the time. And so let's look at these final two statements here. Hold your ground and you will last long. Now, I want to bring in another translation of this because I think it helps to bring out, and it's representative of a lot of the different translations. There's a lot I could bring in here. I'm just trying to highlight some key ones. But another way that this has been translated is retain one's source is to be long lasting. So when we're thinking about source, kind of understanding your place in the nature of things gets back to understanding this larger relational context in which we see this overarching pattern that they refer to as Tao, that becomes that source or that root, that thing that we want to be grounded in. And so the more that we can be grounded in that, the more it's going to add to this idea of long lasting. That when we depart from that, when the Tao is forgotten, that's when we tend to devolve into force and control and ambition that ultimately can be very destructive. And then the final line here is, die without perishing, and your life will endure. And this one is a little bit interesting, because what do they mean by die without perishing? And there's a couple of different.
You could have one without the other.
There's some different ways that that's been looked at. Some of it has been more figurative, in the sense of maybe you're dying to the idea of trying to be in this social hierarchy. You're giving up your ambition and desire to try and climb that social ladder, and in doing so, you actually have your life enduring. But I think where that's not necessarily something that we need to rule out, I think the bigger context is getting into how the Taoists, especially in that classical Taoist period, are understanding the concepts of life and death. And so I just want to spend a little bit talking about that. So we'll start with we're going to look at two passages from Zhuangzi, who is another early Taoist writer. And one of the lines that he says that I appreciate a lot, he says, "I was born together with heaven and earth. So the 10,000 things and I are one and the same." So we're definitely bringing in a lot of Taoist concepts here. Again, when it's talking about heaven and earth, Tian Di is this idea of everything, like you could say something like the cosmos, right? So I was born together with the cosmos. The 10,000 things are, again, their colorful way of talking about all the different manifestations that we see around us, that we interact with, that we see, the things that make up our world. And the implication is that whatever we are was born out of that same process, out of that same time. And so how we understand the nature of everything else in the universe is how we need to look at ourselves. And that Taoist perspective is saying there is this Wu, or this absence, of which there's actually something there, but it's just undefinable. You can't touch it or grab hold of it or smell it or see it, but it is the substance, in a sense, that becomes everything. And when it moves into presence, and there's this movement back and forth from absence to presence, where the 10,000 things come into being and go back out, return to the source. And if we understand that ourselves are actually part of that same process, then this idea of perishing, or another way that it's talked about often is being lost, can't really be the case, because what we are is part of that whole big kind of soup, if you want, of stuff that continues to exist, and it's just kind of repurposed. And what we are experiencing is a moment in time when those particular parts came together in the unique configuration that we are, and it will be reconfigured into some other thing down the road. It's not gone. It's just that what we are experiencing is, in a sense, kind of an ongoing change process. So even while we are alive, it's still filled with countless changes from the time that we're a little kid all the way up to whatever point it is that we, cease to be who we are. It's full of change. And so this idea of birth and death are actually just a part of that ongoing series of changes that are always happening. We're always, in a sense, being born. We're always, in a sense, dying. And it's not an interruption in that normal process. When we think about birth and death, it's part of that ongoing, continuously changing aspect of the nature of reality. And I know we're right up at the end of the time, but I had one other quote I'm just going to read here quickly. Again, from Zhuangzi. We're cast into this human form, and it's such happiness. This human form knows change, but the 10,000 changes are utterly boundless. Who could calculate the joys they promise? And so the sage wanders where nothing is hidden and everything is preserved. The sage calls dying young a blessing, and living long a blessing, calls beginnings a blessing and endings a blessing. We might make such a person our teacher, but there's something the 10,000 things belong to, something all change depends upon. Imagine making that your teacher. And of course, the thing that all these depend upon is what they would refer to as the Tao. So we probably would be good to have more time to talk about this last part, but we'll maybe just see if people had some last comments on this before we have to close. Done silent.
I got to jump for a meeting, but this is great. Thanks, Jim.
No worries.
Thanks, guys. I think there's a lot to think about. I don't think I have any jumping questions or anything after that last bit, but I think, like most of these chapters, it's easier said than done, and it's certainly something that needs practice. I think everybody could practice these things.
All right. Well, we'll have to leave it at that then for today. And I want to thank you all again for joining. This will be the last one for this year. We'll pick up again in January in a couple of weeks. So if you are watching this as a video and you'd like to be a part of the live Zoom discussion or the in-person discussion, you can register your email at kinship.cafe, and you'll get links to the videos when they come out, as well as the invitation to both the Zoom and the in-person event. All right, guys, take care and have a great new year.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.